It's my pleasure to talk about the American code system. And I should mention that very few Americans understand this code system. Even as a civil engineering student with a minor in architecture, I was never told anything about the American code system while I was in school. And I think that's pretty true for most of the world. People don't know how they're made, they just deal with them. Unfortunately, this makes many building designers think of codes as an encumbrance, as something to try to get around, rather than something to embrace to produce a better product, which is in fact the building that they design. Now in the United States, the basic regulatory structure, I believe, is similar to what is here in Brazil, in that we don't have a federal code system as such. It is something that is left under our Constitution to the individual cities and states as a police power. So most cities and states can write their own building and fire codes if they wanted to, but it's very difficult to write a code, especially a good code, because it's something that really should be a living document and continually updated to reflect the latest technology in terms of building buildings and making them safe. And because of that, most cities and states rely upon the production of model codes that they can then adopt through their legislative processes to protect the public, responding firefighters, and others with good property and life safety. And there are two quasi-public or private organizations in the United States that promulgate these model codes. And they are the NFPA and the ICC. Now, NFPA, I think most people in this group have heard of. It's an organization founded way back in 1896. And probably fewer of you know that the NFPA was really founded by the sprinkler industry, because it was the sprinkler experts, and I shouldn't just say industry because they were mostly insurance people at that time, who got together to write a standard to provide for the design and installation of sprinkler systems, to make sure that if you were putting a sprinkler system in the building, it would be a good, effective sprinkler system. And that effort was so successful with the development of what is now known as NFPA 13, that they decided to stay together and write other documents, other codes and standards, and that became the National Fire Protection Association. The other group was founded as recently as 1994 by a merger of code organizations that dated back to 1927. And as I came into the industry in the 1970s, there were three major model code groups that were fairly regional in the United States. And they joined in 1994, became the International Code Council. Now, both of these code systems rely upon some basis of fairness and reasonableness. So they're looking for who is the group that will make the decision on what is reasonable for effective protection of our buildings. In the NFPA system, this reasonableness is provided through a consensus process of balanced interests. So they put together committees that represent a wide range of interests and have undertaken the philosophy that when these groups of diverse interests can agree on what is reasonable, then that is what you want to have as your code. In the ICC system, International Code Council, they rely upon government workers, the people who are paid to be our building and fire officials, who have no other commercial interests, to make the final decisions as to what is reasonable and proper in terms of the regulation. So that is the difference between these two systems, and those two systems produce building codes, fire codes, and standards. And just to give you an overview, the codes in general provide for where we provide protection, especially for an industry such as the fire sprinkler industry. Codes will say where sprinkler systems are installed, and standards tend to say how sprinkler systems are installed. Now, as you can see, building codes, of course, address new construction of buildings. Fire codes tend to deal with existing buildings and maintaining safety in those buildings. And as again, I say, standards provide the details for design and installation, the how to install the systems that we rely upon. And as you hear speakers talking about certification of products, those are generally a requirement of the standards. So NFPA 13, for example, has requirements that the products used in a fire sprinkler system, such as sprinklers, must be listed, which means approved by an organization that's involved in the testing of those sprinklers to make sure they're suitable for their end use. So that's how certification comes in through the standards. The codes and standards produced by NFPA and ICC, it's an interesting mix. For the most part in the United States, the International Building Code is accepted pretty much used throughout the United States. The NFPA also produces a building code which actually sees use in countries outside the US. I've been told that most of the buildings produced for the Chinese Olympics were produced under the NFPA 5000 building code. It also sees some use in the Middle East. In terms of fire codes, the International Fire Code produced by the ICC is used in about 42 states. The NFPA 1 Fire Code is adopted statewide in 19 states. That means some cities in the states, in our 50 states, might be using different codes in order to make that add up to 50. And the Life Safety Code, which is originally started as a building exits code, also produced by the NFPA as NFPA 101, is used in some fashion in all 50 states. For example, it's used by our federal government in the regulation of nursing homes. But it's also adopted statewide in 43 states, which produces a situation in some cases where you have more than one code, and a building designer must use the more restrictive provisions of both codes. And then, of course, we have our standards. NFPA standards predominate. We know standards such as NFPA 13 for sprinklers, NFPA 14 for standpipes, NFPA 20 for fire pumps, NFPA 72 for alarms. The ICC produces some standards, but not so much in the fire field. They produce standards dealing with things like greenhouses and other building components, but we in the fire field generally see NFPA standards. So our system is not exactly clean, but it works. It seems to be very effective. With regard to the NFPA codes and standards, the revision cycles begin twice each year and take about 2 years to complete. And every NFPA document is updated on a 3, 4, or 5-year cycle, depending on how fast the technology is changing. The technical committees are key to the NFPA system. They're limited to 30 voting members. And they're balanced so that no single interest represents more than 1/3 of the committee. If you look at how the NFPA classifies interests, you'll see the categories here. And many of them are represented in this room. We have manufacturers. We have companies that install or maintain systems. We have insurers. We have research and testing organizations. So the idea, again, of the NFPA system is to bring all these different interests together, give them good, solid technical information, let them share the information, and let them decide what is reasonable and proper. And the NFPA standards and codes are often viewed as minimum standards and codes for a reasonable level of protection. The NFPA process these days has 4 stages: public input, public comment, technical meeting of the NFPA, and the Standards Council action that issues the final document. One of the things I want to point out is that the NFPA process is open to everyone. Everyone in the US, everyone in Europe, everyone in South America as well, because a lot of it is carried out over the internet. So anyone in this room, if you use, for example, NFPA 13, and you see a section that you think is wrong, or the language could be improved to make it clearer, you're invited, when the document goes into cycle, to submit a proposal to change the wording of that section. The committee then meets, and at its first draft meeting, establishes a position on every proposal that comes in. And those revisions that pass ballot are included as a first draft report. There's a 10-week period following publication of that first draft report when the public is again invited to take a look at what the committee has in mind in terms of changes. And after the closing of that period, the committee meets again for a second draft meeting. Successful comments are then published in a second draft report. The document then goes to the technical meeting of the NFPA, which takes place in June of each year. People who are still unsatisfied with some part of the procedure are invited to submit motions that can be made from the floor. And if those are certified as proper, given the history of the issue, the body politic, the entire assembly will vote to produce a final version. That final version is again balloted through the committee, and the Standards Council then sits as a group and considers not just one standard or one code, but all of the documents in that cycle and makes the final decision on issuance of the code or standard. They will hear appeals on their decisions after 20 days, but they make the decision based on all the information available to it. And actually, we have the current chair of the NFPA Standards Council with us here today. Carrie Bell is one of our speakers from Underwriters Laboratories. And so he's a very important guy. So if there's something you're concerned about, talk to Carrie Bell. He'll help you out. But the ICC has, that's the corresponding organization that is where the final decision is made by code officials. It's similar in the sense that there are a number of steps in the process to ensure that it's a fair process with lots of input from all interest groups. They use 2 cycles for their documents. One cycle addresses building code, what they call their existing building code and their mechanical and plumbing codes. And they have a separate cycle that addresses certain chapters of building code dealing with fire protection because they want to coordinate that with the fire code itself, and the International Residential Code. And they also, they published all of their documents at 3-year intervals. If you look at their system and try to compare it to what I talked about with the NFPA, it's very similar because, again, they deal originally with inputs, they deal with them at the committee level, they present them to hearings, and ultimately there's a vote to update the latest edition of the codes. Now, it's interesting that in the International Code Council, this past week has been a very busy week. There were public comment hearings that took place in Kansas City, Missouri, and so those were the sort of the approval of the committee decisions in terms of changing the codes, including the International Residential Code. And now that final decision that came out of the committee and the group that met in Kansas City will go for an online ballot, which the ICC is using now, so that all their governmental members can vote, and they don't have to show up in a certain place. And so they will be voting in November to give their final approval, final consensus. And the way the ICC is regulated, these governmental votes are handed out to various cities and communities based on the size of that community. So as you can see here, a city with a fairly small population of up to 50,000 would have up to 4 voting representatives, whereas a larger city might have 8, and the largest cities have 12 voting representatives. But all of these voting representatives are fire and building officials, people who are actually charged with enforcing the code at their local level. So they understand the implications of what the code is requiring, and they are expected to be the people to make sure that the regulations are followed, whether it's from the point of using certified sprinklers up to the point of the right number of exits and the right exit widths and the right materials being used in the construction. Now, I do want to say that these code processes, and it's amazing that even though you have 2 different groups, the end result as far as requiring sprinklers is very similar, because reasonable people, when given the proper information and data, and people who reasonably consider the risks, will recognize the value of fire sprinkler systems. And so these slides come from the year 2000. Since the year 2000, in the US codes, and this doesn't matter whether we're talking NFPA or ICC, we put sprinklers in all our covered malls, all our theater complexes, all high-rise buildings, public assemblies of size, schools of size. Sprinklers are required in factories and mercantile occupancies and storage areas, storage buildings. And you can see it's anything of size, anything basically over 1,000 square meters or combined fire areas on all floors of more than 2,000 square meters, or more than 3 stories in height. For now, more than a decade and a half, all of these buildings, as they're built, are being sprinklered. All of our healthcare and detention facilities, our prisons, hotels and motels, except for a while those that were fairly small with direct access to the outside for each guest room. And pretty much all apartments buildings now in the US are provided with sprinklers, all multifamily housing. The one area where progress is still being made is in single-family homes. And actually, both the NFPA codes and the ICC codes now require that new single-family homes be provided with sprinklers. So any new house. But as model codes, they have to be adopted state by state or city by city. And there is a political process in which home builders in most states have to this point been able to convince people that the legislators shouldn't require the sprinklers in homes. So these model codes have been edited to take that provision out in most states. And at present, while we have a growing number of cities and towns that do require sprinklers, even in new homes, there are only 2 states, California and Maryland, of our 50 states, where if a new house is built, the future homeowner can be assured that fire sprinklers will be present in that house and that their family will be safe. So we expect this trend to continue. Those states have had that requirement for some time now, and it seems to be working very well. And over time, we believe all homes will be sprinklered. Now, fire sprinklers have also been increasingly installed in existing buildings on a retrofit basis under our codes. Now, a lot of these retrofit requirements have come because individual cities have suffered losses that have led them to say, we need sprinkler systems in our existing high-rise buildings. We've had a federal mandate that says all skilled nursing homes, in order to get federal funds, must now be sprinklered. College dormitories in many universities have voluntarily put sprinklers into their existing dormitories. Nightclubs, several states have enacted requirements, and now we've seen model codes move toward sprinkler requirements in existing nightclubs as well. NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, and NFPA 1, the Fire Code, are especially noteworthy because those documents have chapters dealing with existing buildings as separate from new buildings and telling you where you need sprinklers in existing buildings. And NFPA 1, for example, says that a high-rise building must be protected with fire sprinklers within 12 years of the adoption of that code. So it gives the building owners 12 years to retrofit their high-rise building with fire sprinklers. If I were to look at the US code systems and make recommendations for other organizations, other countries thinking about developing model codes or national codes, obviously you want something that can be done efficiently and effectively, and that's why model codes are good, even if it has to be adopted state by state and city by city. The code process should be clear and fair, open to public proposals, and with ultimate decision-making in the hands of a group that can be considered unbiased or with offsetting biases through a consensus process. And then once that document is there, the legislators can be expected to adopt it because it has been developed in a fair and clear manner, and perhaps the legislators then won't feel the need to get involved in the details of those codes. Ultimately, the most important thing is that the individuals involved should be competent and have access to the best available information and data. It's, again, important to realize that these are living documents. They have to recognize new technology. So we want to get these groups, on an ongoing basis, the best information available. Thank you very much.